Join us as we focus on extraordinary Catholic people, a Catholic life. Zoom in on unique Catholic places, the Catholic experience, and take a snapshot of local Catholic events, Catholic happenings. The Living Bread Radio Network presents Catholic Close-Up, Catholic Close-Up with Michael Roberts. We'll introduce you to people, places, and events that are shaping our Catholic culture today. And now, here's Michael Roberts with today's edition of Catholic Close-Up.
You know, whenever we read the Passion narratives in Scripture, and we read them, of course, especially during the season of Lent, Holy Week, Good Friday, we always hear about after Jesus died, the fact that he was placed in a tomb, but he was wrapped in burial cloths. One of the Scripture readings says clean linen, one of them says burial cloths, but we know from Scripture that he was wrapped in those clothes. And of course, we also know after the resurrection, when they went into the tomb for the first time, that those cloths were sitting off to the side. We hear about that in Scripture as well. And this all leads to the Shroud of Turin. And this time of the year, as we're in the season of Lent, it's a great time to talk about the Shroud of Turin. It's been a topic of discussion really throughout all Christianity now for many, many years. And we've got a local guy with us on the phone right now. His name is David Onysko, and he is kind of an expert, if you will, on the Shroud of Turin. He has dedicated his life now to studying this and to really making this a part of his life. He joins us now by telephone. David, so nice to have you with us here on Catholic Close-Up.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a privilege to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
So you are a syndenologist. You study syndenology, and I learned something, David. Syndenology is actually the study of the shroud itself, right?
Yes. A new word dedicated to shroud study.
Now, what's interesting about your story, too, though, David, I might add, is that you didn't just go to school for this. This is kind of something that you've taken on here later in your career, right?
It is. I started this. The years go by very quickly, Mike. but I started looking at this thing in 1980 when National Geographic came out with an article. Really the first article that detailed the scientific experimentation that was done on the shroud in 1978. There was a scientific team comprised of about 40 scientists that went over there, and they looked at it for 5 days, 24-hour days, round the clock. And 2 years later, their results, or much of what they had tested, was published in National Geographic. And I saw that magazine, and I was just amazed at what I saw and read. And it's just been an ongoing thing ever since. The fact that this thing, if it is authentic, is the most studied object in human history. And so it grabbed my attention in 1980, and it really hasn't let go. And with each question answered, there are 10 more that are brought to the surface.
It's fascinating, and of course it makes your job as a syndenologist ever more important and never-ending, because there's a lot of things to learn, a lot of things to study about this. I guess we kind of go back, David, and start with the history of this. Perhaps there's some of our listeners who aren't as familiar with the Shroud of Turin as others. I know from my perspective, I remember studying it in religion class. I went to Catholic school, so it was a part of our curriculum, and I forget which exact grade it was, but we did study this. Talk to our listeners about the Shroud of Turin and give us kind of a quick history lesson on the shroud itself.
Yes. Well, when we're talking history, the route of the shroud is not, exactly tied down. We have to make some inferences. We believe, obviously, that it came from the tomb, and the question is, where did it go from there? And why would it have been saved at all, if you will? Right. Well, if it is the burial cloth of Christ, the disciples obviously thought it was important. They might have seen something on that cloth. Well, we remember that in the Gospels it says that Peter and John ran to the tomb and they saw and believed. So something about the cloth got their attention. From there, we can go to the city of Edessa, which is north of Israel. There was a king during the time of Christ. His name was Abgar. According to historical sources, there are several, Abgar received a cloth with an imprint of Jesus on it. Now, in terms of how it got there, or how the image was on the cloth, or who took it to Abgar, I'll save. We just don't have time to get into
Sure.
that. But the point is that during the time of Christ, there was this cloth that was given to King Abgar with the miraculous image of Christ's face on it. Okay, that's established. Fast forward several hundred years after the death of Abgar, this face cloth, if you will, it's known as the image of Edessa. It was said to have been given to him by a disciple, Thaddeus. It disappears from the historical record. And it reemerges in the 6th century, when they're repairing the wall of the city after a flood. Above the western gate, in repairing the wall, they discover this face cloth again. And it's believed that it was bricked up into the wall, if you will, to safeguard it from Abgar's second son, who was a pagan. He was not a Christian. According to the record, when Abgar received this, he became a Christian. The whole city became a Christian city. And then when his second son ascends to the throne, it disappears. He's a pagan. He begins to persecute Christians and destroy religious artifacts in the city. So it's rediscovered, if you will, about 525 above the western gate. And for several hundred years, it is, once again, thought to be a miraculous cloth imprint with Jesus' face on it, though, Mike. Only the face. Okay, let's go to 944 A.D., when the Byzantine army is sent to Edessa, which is now under Muslim control, and they are sent there to take this Christian relic artifact from the Muslims. 944 A.D. From 525, it's rediscovered, and for a period of about 400 years, it's now in the control of Muslims. So the Byzantine army is sent there, they take it, they grab it, take it back to Constantinople, and upon taking it back to Constantinople, Mike, it's discovered that this face cloth is actually a full-length cloth. And it was thought that it was folded up and disguised as being, a burial shroud. For whatever reason, they chose to disguise it. But this image of Edessa, this face cloth that was given by Abgar, by one of the disciples, after the death of Jesus, becomes a full-length burial cloth in 944 A.D. They're one and the same, and throughout the course of history, it isn't discovered that it's a full-length cloth until 944. From that point forward until today, we know it as a single cloth. No more in history is this face imprint, miraculous face imprint, the image of Edessa, referred to anymore. It disappears from history at the same time a full-length cloth emerges, suggesting that they were one and the same. Well, from 944 to today, our records of the shroud are very, very intact, if you will. So, I can get into a very, much more detailed history, but it would just take too much time.
But it's fascinating, and from my perspective, I can't help but think, any history buff, anybody who's interested in history, whether it's the history of Christianity, of Jesus Christ himself, or history in general, I mean, this is just absolutely fascinating, and I have a feeling that's kind of what piqued your curiosity here right from the beginning. It is.
It is fascinating, and what kind of puzzles me, Mike, is that so many people know so little about this.
Right.
And there's somewhat of an indifference, an apathy, if you will. Well, let's just, take, for instance, that if this thing really did wrap the body of Jesus, if it was his burial cloth, then why wouldn't that be important to people to at least do some investigating on their own?
Yeah.
But over the years, I found, really three answers when you ask them, have you heard of the Shroud of Turin? Oh, yeah, isn't that the burial cloth of Jesus? That's one answer. The second one is, yeah, they proved that thing was a medieval forgery in 1988. And the third answer is, no, I don't know anything about it.
Right.
And so, it's my job, if you will, as well as others in syndenology that I know of, to set the record straight, to give them the facts, the data, the truth about what we know about this thing. It's, any discipline of science or history or or medical procedures, if you will, have been tested on this thing. And so, if you're intellectually honest, if you're objective with the information you're given, then you'd probably conclude that it points in one direction, and that direction is Jesus Christ of Nazareth.
Yeah.
Now the question is, how did the image get there? That's the question. I think we can establish, based on the evidence, the preponderance of evidence, Mike, in courtrooms, they use basically what you're given with the shroud,
Sure.
Data, research, information, and you have to make a decision. You have to weigh what the preponderance of evidence suggests, and we can do the same thing with the Shroud of Turin. So we can say, well, it points in Jesus' direction. The question then becomes, how did the image get there? That's a much more difficult question to answer than the first.
We're talking with David Onysko. He is a syndenologist. He likes to study the shroud, and that's what the study of syndenology is, the study of the shroud. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin. David is from Cleveland, so right here in our listening area on the Living Bread Radio Network. And David, as we've just heard, has devoted a lot of his studies and his effort to finding out more about the Shroud of Turin. And it's an interesting subject no matter how you think about it. But David, I want to switch gears a little bit, because we are a Catholic radio station here, and so I want to kind of look at this through the lens of the Catholic Church. And what's interesting about the Shroud of Turin and the Catholic Church, from what I have researched, is that the Catholic Church has neither confirmed or rejected the Shroud of Turin. However, there are a couple of popes that have mentioned it. One in particular is, of course, St. John Paul II. He has talked about it before. Pius XII has mentioned it as well. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you would, and as far as the Catholic Church is concerned with the shroud.
Yeah, well, prior to 1983, the Catholic Church, they were the custodians of the shroud. They simply, kept it, housed it, protected it for the former royal family of Italy, known as the House of Savoy. In World War II, the king was exiled from Italy. He remained in exile. Umberto, when he died in 83, instead of giving it to a family member, a descendant, he willed it to the Catholic Church at that point, and they became the official custodians of it. I believe Pope John Paul had said that it doesn't belong to the Catholic Church, it belongs to all of Christendom. Each successive pope seems to, want to put their stamp on it, to have
Right.
an exposition under their papacy. Pope Benedict did, Pope Francis did just here recently, and I just saw on the internet where, and I don't know what the gathering is, but there's a youth gathering coming up in 19, and he is going to make the Shroud of Turin available to the youth that are going to be taking part in this gathering, and for the life of me, I forget what it is.
Yeah.
But
might be World Youth
anyway,
Day.
they bring it out, and instead of being only shown really 2, 3, maybe 4 times a century at most, has been seen in 1978 during the scientific testing. It was seen in 1998. I saw it in 1998 because that was the 100th year anniversary of the first photograph taken in 1898 by Secondo Pia. It was also shown in 2000 because it was the year of Jubilee in the Catholic Church. It was also shown in 2010 by Pope Benedict and in 2015 by Pope Francis.
Wow.
So each of them, want to get their exposition under their papacy, if you will.
Sure. Again, it's very fascinating stuff. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin with David Onysko. He is from Cleveland, and he has devoted his career, most of his career, I should say, to studying the Shroud of Turin, a lot of it. Talk to us, David, about before this. You were a teacher, I understand, correct?
Yes. I taught for about 25 years health and physical education, kindergarten through 12th grade. And, along with this, over the years, I have pursued, like you said, syndenology. I've been to 8 scientific conferences, historical, scientific, and theological conferences, including one in Rome. Like I said, I saw it in 98 and I saw it in 2000. I was able to present a paper in 2014 at a scientific conference in St. Louis, and the name of the paper, Mike, was The Shekinah Glory of the Lord and the Shroud of Turin. You know, when Peter, James, and John were on the Mount of Transfiguration, they saw him,
Right.
With Moses and Elijah,
Uh-huh.
and he was transfigured. He became light. When Moses came down from the mountain meeting with God, he shone, his face shone. He had to put a veil over it. So, Jesus is light,
Right.
literally as well as symbolically.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that image on the shroud was a Shekinah glory event in the tomb.
I'm telling you, it's just absolutely fascinating when you dig into this and learn more about it. And that's what you have done. David Onysko, our guest here on Catholic Close-Up. I'm your host, Michael Roberts. Thanks for joining us here today. And David, let's talk now about Man in the Shroud Ministries, because that is kind of what you're doing now. I mentioned that you're devoting your life to this. And one of the ways that you devote it is going out and doing talks about this, informing others about the Shroud of Turin. Talk to us about Man in the Shroud Ministries.
Yeah, Man in the Shroud Ministries began, a couple decades ago, and it, for lack of a better word, it just kind of evolved. The more I learned about the Shroud of Turin, the more compelled I felt to share that information with others. And so, I always, looked at him, I would say the man in the shroud, because I want people to make their own decision about the Shroud of Turin. So I call him the man in the shroud. And so that quest to share with others began, like I said, a couple decades ago, and I just wanted to let people know, about this artifact that so many people knew so little about. So I began, I've done it in homes for people, small groups in homes. I've done it, in nursing homes. It doesn't matter where I'm asked to go. I never want to miss an opportunity to share the information here, because at the very least, it gives us an example of what Jesus went through. At the very least, if it's not him, at least gives us, and something that we can look toward and say, well, if this isn't him, he went through something, and it would have been worse than what the man in the shroud went through, because Jesus suffered and was marred more than any man. So here, we can put something tangible to our faith that we read from the Scriptures. He was scourged, he was flogged. Well, we can see it on the cloth. We can see what the instruments were. We can recreate them. Roman scourges. We see the spear wound in the side. We see the crown of thorns. That a helmet of thorns. It wasn't a wreath or a circle. It was a helmet of thorns. What other person in history wore a helmet of thorns? It was unique to Jesus. Yet the man in the shroud also wore a helmet of thorns. The man in the shroud was pierced in his side, as was Jesus. His legs were not broken. On the bottom of his feet, he has dirt from particles that are indigenous to Jerusalem, the limestone quarries of Jerusalem. Pollen particles that have been lifted off the surface of the cloth from areas, geography, where we know the shroud has been in its history. Real blood on the cloth, that was there prior to the image. If this thing was a forgery, a forger would have painted it first, the image, and then put the blood on.
Right.
The blood was on the cloth prior to the image, because there's no image under the blood. And so, and when we look at the image, Mike, it's on the surface, on the tip of the threads. It's on the top one or two fibers deep into this thread. It's not saturated all the way through the threads. The fibers aren't cemented together as the blood fibers are, you would expect it. If it was a painting, it would have, coagulated, if you will, and caused all those fibers and threads to stick together. But that's not the case.
Right.
We believe some kind of light mechanism created the image. And that light wasn't reflected light. It came from the body itself.
Right.
And that light most likely is radiation. And this is where we're going with the shroud. It's taking us in a direction of science, Mike, that we're not prepared to go yet.
Right.
And that's where it's taking us. So, it's just, the fascination began in 1980, and it just continues to this day. And so this information has to be disseminated.
Right.
And that's my job. That's what I want to do in this ministry.
And it's a process, too, I'm sure. As history can tell, this is a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight.
No. It took, until 1898,
right.
For the scientific community to really see what this thing is. Now, for centuries, it was thought to be, and still is thought to be, but, it's been protected. It's been, if you will, revered. It's been, a special artifact that for centuries many believed it to be authentic. So it survived, which is miraculous in and of itself.
Exactly.
Fires, it survived.
Yeah.
So there's so many things about this thing that demand our attention. It's an intellectual challenge for us to look at this and try to understand, what is it, trying to tell us. And I believe what it's trying to tell us is that a man was resurrected. And so the passion, the suffering, the passion, the death, the Jewish burial, Mike, and the resurrection, I believe, are written on this cloth.
Yeah.
The whole gospel.
It gives you goosebumps, really, when you think of it from that perspective.
Oh, in syndonology, I've heard it said many times, this is the fifth gospel. You got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
right?
And you have the Shroud of Turin. But then someone said, no. If it is authentic, it's the first gospel.
Right.
It was in the tomb before the other four were written.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and it would be just like, God the Father to provide a little bit of help. The
Sure.
doubting Thomas, Mike, needed a little bit of help.
Yeah, you're right.
He saw his, his master torn to pieces, thoroughly dead. And so when they saw him and they said, we've seen him, he had a legitimate, response.
Sure.
I won't believe it until I touch his wounds. And, instead of, Jesus reprimanding him for his lack of faith, he said, Thomas, do what you have to do.
Yeah.
Jesus gave him something tangible to help him. And it's interesting that at the dawn of the 20th century, science began to say to the doubting Thomases of the age, look at my wounds, probe this cloth, see what it offers, the information that it has contained.
Wow. Yeah, this is good stuff. David Onysko, our guest here on Catholic Close-Up. Once again, I'm your host, Michael Roberts. Thanks for joining us here today. We're having a great discussion on the Shroud of Turin. David is from the Cleveland area. Also, the Man in the Shroud Ministries is what he has founded. And David, before we let you go, one thing we do want to talk about, coming up here in March, you've got a big event, and it's really another one of those ways to teach people about the Shroud, right?
Yes, it is, and thank you for mentioning that, Mike, and giving me the opportunity to let your listeners know what is coming. I'm very excited to share. It's interesting, my ministry is Man in the Shroud, but I am bringing to the greater Cleveland area the Man of the Shroud exhibit. It's a world-class exhibit. It's going to be here for 2 weeks in March. The first week, it'll be here from Wednesday through Thursday at the Breen Center for the Performing Arts on the campus of St. Ignatius High School. Now, this information, by the way, that I'm giving your listener is on my website, manintheshroud.org. So if they went to manintheshroud.org, they can see all this information.
Okay.
So the first week, it's going to be at St. Ignatius Breen Center for the Performing Arts, and the second week at Grace Church in Middleburg Heights. And it'll be there Wednesday through Friday. Again, all the information's there. And open to the public, daytime hours. And then I am going to speak, Mike, at the end of each week on Friday night. I will speak. It'll be a $10 ticketed event. And all the proceeds are going to be going to Cleveland Right to Life. We're going to save babies. Voice of the Martyrs. Those who are Christian organizations, ministries on the front lines. So all the money's being given away. We're going to speak. We're going to have an exhibit. We want your listeners to come and attend and be blessed. The name, the mission statement of our exhibit is to make known the passion of Jesus Christ. And with the Shroud of Turin, you can make known the passion of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I might add, we're also having made authentic instruments of torture, an authentic Roman spear, crucifixion nails, scourges. All these things are being manufactured so that the viewer of the exhibit can actually see and have a visceral response to instruments of the passion.
Wow. Once again, manintheshroud.org, manintheshroud.org.
Yes.
You can find out more information. And again, those dates coming up here in March as far as when that exhibit will be in the Cleveland area. David Onysko, our guest here on Catholic Close-Up. David, we are out of time, but what a pleasure it has been to talk with you. It's so fascinating, and what a job you have, what a task you have as a syndonologist to truly study this. And again, this time of the year, as we're in the season of Lent, kind of brings it closer to home more than ever, but truly a ministry and truly a wonderful thing you are doing. Thank you so much for being with us and taking the time to let me interview you here on Catholic Close-Up.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. The pleasure's all mine. God bless you and what you're doing, Living Bread Radio, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
And that's our show for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Michael Roberts, and until next time, be at peace. Tune in next week as we continue to take an in-depth look at our Catholic community right here on Catholic Close-Up.
Catholic Close-Up is a production of the Living Bread Radio Network in Canton, Ohio. For an audio archive of today's program, visit livingbreadradio.com, where you can subscribe to the weekly podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week for another edition of Catholic Close-Up.
Hello, this is Bishop George Murray. Join me this Wednesday at 11 a.m. with the Bishop's Corner here on the Living Bread Radio Network. I'll be taking your phone calls and answering your questions about the Catholic faith. I'll also be providing catechetical teaching on a special topic for the day. I look forward to talking to you. That's the Bishop's Corner with me, Bishop George Murray, right here on the Living Bread Radio Network.
Hi, this is Father Jim Corda. Join me for the CTNY production of Wineskins every Sunday morning at 9:30, right here on the Living Bread Radio Network. You'll hear reflections on sacred scripture and the lives of the saints, along with thoughts and current issues from a Catholic perspective. That's Wineskins, heard locally every Sunday morning at 9:30 on the Living Bread Radio Network.
The Living Bread Radio Network presents Great Catholic Music. Enjoy an hour of non-stop sacred music every Sunday. It's a great way to keep holy the Sabbath. Great Catholic Music, Sundays at 1 p.m. on the Living Bread Radio Network.